Today on the Hobby Bench, I'm going to talk about pinning and filling gaps for your miniatures. Last time I talked about assembling your miniatures and doing some prep. I'm going to continue a little bit more on some assembly, talking about pinning specifically and also filling gaps. So I've got a Reaper Bones miniature here I'm going to be working with, and this head, it is a pretty good piece of plastic here. It's got a nice base for it to go into the slot, and it fits in pretty well. You can see here I've got a little bit of a gap. So one way I'm going to try addressing that is to just, give it a bit of a trim and sort of just trim this down just a little. Try to get that a little bit flush. And that's still pretty good. Now, you usually don't want to leave larger gaps because otherwise it's going to look a little unsightly and you're going to have to go back to that and try to fill that in. So I probably could trim off a little bit more, but that's a pretty good size for it. Now, what I'm going to be using this too is just to show you an example of how to add a little bit more strength to a joint. This is pretty thick here. And so if I use super glue, this is going to work out pretty well, I think, to sealing that in. And that's got a good amount of material there in the joints to keep that pretty strong and not wiggle off. That you've got that entire base of the head here to go into that. It's pretty deep. That would fit, I think, pretty well. You wouldn't have to worry about that popping off. But let's say for your arms and maybe for legs of this, if something like this broke off, I could glue it, but odds are it's going to be a weak joint and basically fall off again. So a way of adding some more strength to that is pinning. And a key thing for using that is to pick up a pin drill. And you can get this typically at a lot of hobby shops that do model kits and stuff like that. This is a Tamiya one. So basically you can get a small drill bit that'll go in here. This sort of screws in and tightens out. Pretty easy about it. And what's nice is that the entire base of this rotates on this end here. So you can basically put some pressure on it and then freely rotate that to drill in, and you get a pretty good amount of control on that. What I recommend, if you can, is also get like a hobby vise. I've got one here. You can pick these up at hardware stores. This is pretty cool because this one has like a little suction cup on the bottom of it to keep it mounted. But, this is pretty light piece. You're not going to really need much here. And this is to give it a little bit more strength to it. And I've worked with this before doing that. And so the idea is that you'll just go ahead and just start drilling in a hole and, drill through and get a hole in there. At which point then you can use what I just use as a paper clip. And so you sort of figure out the depth that you need to go into that, and you can mark that off, and you can then do work on the other side. I've got a piece here I've already sort of cut out and used a bit. And so to give you an idea of how to line it up pretty well, I can see, fitting in there where it needs to go. Then what I can do is a little bit of black paint there. Drop that in, and then that will give you an idea of my joint when I put this in here and line that up where I need the drill. And so now I know where I need the drill in there. Basically get my drill in here. You can see here I've got this pinned in. This will fit in, and that slides just right in there. And at that point now, you're going to have a super strong bond now. And not only are you going to have super glue that'll keep that in there, but you also have that piece of metal to add a little bit more reinforcement to that. Now it'll all be a matter of just gluing this all up. I'm going to try to make sure I get glue down there in the joint of that. And this is really old glue. I need to get some better glue for this. We're going to also put a little bit in this hole here. At which point I'm going to definitely use my tweezers here. This will help for keeping all this in. So there's a little bit of super glue in that. That's definitely going to keep that in there. I've got plenty down in here. I'm going to put a little bit more on the joints just up here. Some other areas of surface. And this glue is just super old. I need to get some better super glue that just not stringy everywhere. And that is set. And that head is just not going to go anywhere. It's got that extra support with the metal rod in there, just a little bit of that paper clip to help pin that. And so that'll provide a lot more strength to that. Now, as I mentioned before, for the head, this had a good amount of plastic in it. It's got a pretty wide hole. There's a little bit of an angle cut into it. So I think there's plenty of surface area that it'll work with. But definitely for you working on the joints, like if I broke off that arm, having a pin will definitely help in keeping that in. Now, for Doc Ock here, he looks pretty good. I've got him pretty much set up. I'm ready to probably paint him up. But if you'll notice, there's a little bit of a gap in his arm that I've got there. And to show you here, I've took a photograph as a close-up. You can see that bit of a gap. I just wasn't able to quite fill that in. So a way of getting around that is to try to fill that in with some type of putty or some type of filler to close that gap. Now this doesn't look too bad, but you can see here it is a little bit of a gap that I've got there. And so if I don't do anything, it's really going to be a little jarring to have that crack. It works pretty well because you can see on his other arm there's a little bit of a joint, a little bit of a section in his armor and his costume. And so it may not look too bad, but I'm going to bet like once I paint that up, you're going to end up just having this dark line that's going to carry through. And there's some different things that you can use for this. One thing I recommend, you can always get is what they call green stuff, or here I have some Tamiya epoxy putty. This is putty that once it's combined together will form like a really thick bonding epoxy. The idea for this is to just basically cut off a similar amount. And then what you're going to do is that you'll mix these putties together. You're going to knead this putty together. Sort of take off the protective coating there on that. And you're going to knead this together so it's one uniform color. And once you do that, then it'll basically combine together and form this really strong epoxy resin that you can use then for filling up your gaps. And once it hardens, man, you're not going to be able to break it. And this is good stuff too. I think commonly Games Workshop has some stuff they call green stuff. And so you mix that together. I think it's a blue and a yellow type of epoxy color. You mix it together, it makes it into a green. And at that point, you can go ahead and put that in. And this is sort of neat because, as it's a little pliable for a little while. And sometimes you can get a little bit of water too to help get a little more pliable. But you can use this to sculpt a little bit. So if you've got some sculpting tools, you can put some textures in, that kind of thing. And so it's a way to, add a little more detail. But I for sure would use this stuff for filling in gaps. Just going to want to get a really thin amount here. I'm going to roll this out and then just carefully place this. I'm going to use some tweezers here to do that. Carefully fill this into this gap. I've got a small amount there, just in the bottom. And commonly a good thing to do too is use a little bit, this is going to be a putty molding knife. I've got that little bit there, man. It's just really hard to work with for such a small gap. So then I can use this molding knife to sort of manipulate that in there and smooth that down. And for sure you want to do this while you still can work with this, while it's still pliable. Because once it hardens, you're pretty much going to be stuck with it. And what you can do also is that you can file this down and sand this down more. And so I'm just going to use that to work that in there really carefully and just fill in that gap. And it's hard to tell there, but before there's a bit of a gap that was in there. Now that's filled in pretty well. I've got a little bit more I need to work in here. I'm just going to go ahead and try to get this last little bit down the bottom. And that fills in pretty nicely. And so now that gap that you've got, that joint, it's been sealed up. Now, I'll give another example here. I'm going to work a little bit more on this troll. So you're going to see for this troll, I'm also going to try to work this into this joint. Just try to work around his neck here. And this stuff is just sort of can be a bit of a pain to work with. It's just so tacky. It's hard to get that in there and sometimes make that stick. And so for sure, just having a putty knife helps immensely with this. So what I'm going to try doing then here is just sort of slowly fill this in. So what you can see there is I'm just trying to slowly fill this in and really just press that in and try to smooth it out some. And having these tools helps a lot with that. So another way to fill in gaps, particularly for plastic models, is something that I call sprue glue. Some other folks in the model kit hobby space sort of use this stuff. And the idea is, let's say you have a sprue, the same material that you've got your miniature from. You can trim off really thin sections of that. And I would collect it off into like maybe a small little bottle cap. And then use some cement to help mix that in. And the idea is that you're going to basically melt this plastic down. And it'll form basically like a putty almost that you can use. This takes a little bit of time, but you can basically mix this in really well. And then this will be like a resin somewhat that you can use to fill in your gaps. It's going to have a rough texture, rough surface, but then you can sand that down and fill that in. So that's another way, specifically for plastic models, a way of filling in those gaps. You can see now it's just taking some time, but now this is pretty well melted down. Then that can fill into a gap and you can use that to work with. That's a conclusion for today's video, talking about pinning, just adding a little bit more stability to those joints when you're doing some assembly, and also filling in gaps. And especially for filling in gaps, this is something you want to try doing. Sometimes you can get some unsightly paint lines. Filling it in really helps that out.